Welcome back to another one of our studies in Philippians. Today, we're just looking at two verses in Philippians 2. This is a great passage. As we said last time, we're slowing it down because we want to try to grasp what Paul is saying here. It's very important. So please read along with me as we read Philippians 2, 6, and 7. Who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. Paul continues telling people that, of course, that they were to have the mind of Christ. And then in just demonstrating that, he shares one of the greatest Christological passages in all of Scripture. Some feel it was a hymn of the early church because it was so poetic. But regardless of whether it was or not, there is nothing that really equals it in theological depth or even poetic grandeur. Paul speaks of Jesus by saying, who, being the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. It was important for him to establish that Christ did not aspire, nor did he somehow elevate himself to a higher position. His nature was authentically that of God, and as such, he was the truest and fullest expression of God in human form. What he had already was not something to be grasped. He didn't need to cling to his status because it was already who he was. Now, Satan, in contrast, tried to grasp what he was not, and with no interest in unity. We remember that Satan's fall was because he sought to be equal to God, with no interest in being with God. But Jesus, as part of the three in one that is the Holy Godhead from all eternity, is so equal as to be one with the other persons of the Trinity. That is triune, three distinct persons, yet so profoundly united as to literally be the one person of God. That kind of unity in God's self-contained, loving community is the basis for Jesus' mindset, the model of humility for his church. That's hard for us to even grasp. But we know that the setting aside of the advantage of his divine form constitutes a sacrifice that allowed in his incarnation, not only for Christ taking on human flesh and form, but taking upon himself a reduction that human themselves cannot fathom, that we can't grasp it. The creator became his created. The author became one of his story's characters. Now, what we celebrate in Christmas was the beginning of the emptying of himself. In fact, the King James Version tells us that Christ emptied himself. It doesn't say that unfortunately, in the NIV. But we think about this. The omnipotent, the omniscient, the omnipresent God became finite, limited to a time and place, constrained with a body, with tiny, fragile limbs that could not control themselves, and with having absolute dependence upon the help of others. He whose breath formed humanity sentenced himself to a body that was all the same as a human animal's, with all the things that happen to us, with bruises and sniffles and frustrations that we have and what we face in this body of ours. Paul is clear that this humility practiced by God was self-imposed. He said he made himself nothing. And what's more, he did this because of who he was, being in the very nature God. The creator reduced himself to nothing for the sake of his creatures and made that part of his nature. If we could imagine shrinking to become an amoeba, think about this for a moment. Suppose that I said to you, you're, say, in your early 20s, and I say, look, there's a mud puddle out here, and there's a bunch of amoeba there, and we know that mud puddle's gonna all dry up here soon enough. It's going to evaporate, and they're all moving toward destruction. We need to warn them, and we can get them out of there. I don't know how we get them out of there, but we're going to get them out of there. But we need someone to tell them. I would like for you to give up your body, give up your future, give up all your powers, everything else, and I want you to go, and I want you to become a one-celled creature and live there among them and tell them, oh, and by the way, they're going to kill you. Imagine that. If you really had to face something like that, would you give up all the options you have as a human being to become a little one-celled creature that cannot see, that cannot hear, that cannot speak, that cannot decide for itself, that cannot move from one place to another other than this little puddle of water. Would you be willing to do that? And yet Christ, knowing all the limitations, which are far greater than we're talking about a human becoming an amoeba, it was far greater than that. But if we can think about that, we'd have some small inkling of what Christ did for us in order to come and be among us. And we think about that. When Jesus came, he didn't even give himself a favored position in some royal family. I mean, you think that he put himself in some place of prominence. I mean, wouldn't Rome have been better than Nazareth? Wouldn't Athens have been better than Bethlehem? Wouldn't it have been a better place for him to show himself to the world? But no, he sought the lowest place, taking on the form of a slave, not royalty, a slave. And because we already know, because we talked about this, slaves occupied the bottom rung in the world, and he chose the lowest place, below every other place, where he would enter into the world. If we hope to have the mindset of Christ, we must dwell on what this humility is that God did and became, and what it should mean to us. Now, an athlete might put all that he has to win a race, but Christ emptied himself to lose our life's race by being killed, and in a most humiliating death. He set his glory aside and the privilege to be used, and he was abused. Rather than seeking blessing, he came for beatings. Rather than seek out our relationships for support, he chose people who he knew would fail and betray him. Rather than seek comfort, he chose to think about it. He chose the splinters of a manger and of a carpenter's shop and a cross. That is what Christ has done for us. That is what he did in his humiliation. As we enter the Christmas season, we talk about the incarnation. We think this eternal God became us to dwell among us, and did so as a servant, as a slave. And how do you approach your living in the world when you compare it to how Christ approached his living among us? God bless you.